The blizzard came without warning, sweeping across the high desert plateau with a fury that caught even the most experienced ranchers off guard. Jack Morrison had been tending to his cattle when the first flakes began to fall, innocent enough at first, but within minutes the world had transformed into a white wall of howling wind and stinging ice. He had tried to make it back to his ranch house, but the storm disoriented him, turned familiar landmarks into ghost shapes, and soon he found himself stumbling through knee-deep snow with no idea which direction led to safety. His horse had bolted hours ago, spooked by a lightning strike that split the darkening sky. Now Jack was alone, his fingers numb inside his gloves, his face raw from the wind's assault. He had been ranching in this territory for 15 years, had survived harsh winters and brutal summers, but this storm was different. This was the kind of cold that killed men, the kind that found its way through layers of wool and leather and settled into the bones like a living thing with teeth. As darkness fell completely, Jack knew he was in serious trouble. His legs were growing heavy, his thoughts sluggish. He recognized the signs of hypothermia from stories told around campfires, tales of men who had simply sat down in the snow and never stood up again. He needed shelter, needed fire, but in this whiteout he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The wind screamed around him like something alive and angry, and for the first time in his life, Jack Morrison felt genuine fear settle in his chest. Then he saw her, or thought he saw her. A figure moving through the storm with impossible ease, as if the blizzard was nothing more than a spring breeze. At first he thought she was a hallucination, his freezing brain conjuring phantom help, but then she was beside him, her hand on his arm, her voice cutting through the wind with words he couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear. "Follow me." She was Apache. He could tell from her clothing and features, a young woman wrapped in what seemed like impossibly thin garments for such a storm. Yet she moved with confidence, guiding him through the snow to an outcropping of rocks that provided some shelter from the worst of the wind. Jack collapsed against the stone, his body shaking uncontrollably, his teeth chattering so hard he thought they might shatter. He watched through blurry eyes as she began to work. He expected her to gather wood, to build a fire as any sensible person would, but instead she did something that made no sense to his frozen mind. She began to dig into the snow itself, creating a hollow in the drift that had piled against the rocks. Her movements were practiced and efficient, and within minutes she had created a space large enough for both of them to fit inside. "Fire!" Jack managed to croak through his numb lips. "We need fire." She shook her head and gestured to the snow cave she had created. Then, to his complete bewilderment, she began to remove his wet outer clothing. He tried to protest, tried to explain that he would freeze without his coat, but she was insistent and surprisingly strong. She stripped off his soaked jacket and his wet wool shirt, leaving only his undershirt, then guided him into the snow cave. Jack was certain he was about to die. The idea of taking shelter in snow, of removing his warm clothing in the middle of a blizzard, went against every instinct he possessed. But he was too weak to resist, and some part of his clouded mind recognized that this woman knew something he didn't. She crawled into the space beside him, pulling snow blocks to seal the entrance, leaving only a small opening near the top. The wind's howl became muffled, distant. In the sudden quiet, Jack could hear his own ragged breathing, could feel the violent shaking of his body. The woman pulled some kind of hide blanket from her pack and wrapped it around both of them, then settled in beside him, her body warm against his shaking frame. She began to speak softly in Apache, words he couldn't understand but that somehow soothed him nonetheless. Gradually, impossibly, Jack realized he was no longer getting colder. The shaking began to subside. The small space they occupied held their body heat, and the snow walls, rather than freezing them, seemed to insulate them from the savage cold outside. His mind, clearing slightly, began to grasp the physics of it. Snow was an insulator. The cave was protecting them from the wind. The air inside, warmed by their bodies, wasn't escaping through the snow walls. "Who are you?" he managed to ask when he could control his jaw enough to speak. "Nalin," she said simply. Then, in halting English, "I teach you stay alive." Through that long night, as the blizzard raged outside their snow shelter, Nalin taught Jack Morrison lessons his 15 years of ranching had never provided. She explained, in broken English supplemented by gestures, how her people had survived in mountains and deserts for generations, how they understood the land in ways white settlers had forgotten or never known. Fire, she explained, was not always the answer. Fire required dry wood, required shelter from wind, required constant feeding. Fire created smoke that could suffocate in an enclosed space. Fire drew moisture from the air and could actually make you colder if you weren't careful. But snow, properly used, was a fortress against cold. It held air in tiny pockets, each one a barrier against freezing temperatures. A snow cave could maintain a temperature near freezing even when the air outside dropped to deadly lows. She taught him about layers, about how wet clothing was worse than no clothing at all because water conducted heat away from the body. She showed him how to pack snow against the walls of their shelter to make them stronger, how to maintain the small air hole that prevented suffocation while keeping most of their warmth inside. As the hours passed, Jack learned that Na Lin had been traveling to trade with another Apache group when the storm struck. Unlike him, she had immediately sought to create shelter rather than trying to push through. She had seen him stumbling in the snow and recognized the signs of someone about to die from cold. Despite being a stranger, despite the tensions between her people and the white ranchers who had claimed their ancestral lands, she had stopped to help. "Why?" Jack asked. "Why help me?" Na Lin was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My grandmother teach me. All people deserve to live. Storm does not care if you are Apache or white. Cold kills everyone the same." Jack felt shame wash through him, warm and uncomfortable. He had dismissed the Apache as primitive, had considered their ways backward compared to the modern methods he and other ranchers employed. Yet here he was, alive only because this young woman possessed knowledge that his civilization had lost or never acquired. She had been comfortable in conditions that were killing him, had slept in snow before, knew it not as an enemy but as a tool for survival. As dawn broke, the storm finally began to ease. The howling wind dropped to a whisper, then to silence. Na Lin carefully broke open their shelter's entrance, and they emerged into a transformed world. Snow had piled in massive drifts, covering familiar landmarks, but the sky was clearing, showing patches of brilliant blue between thinning clouds. Jack's ranch house was visible now, less than half a mile away. He had been so close to safety yet so far from survival without help. Na Lin helped him back to his home, staying long enough to ensure he was truly safe, that his fingers and toes showed no signs of frostbite, that he understood how to warm himself slowly rather than rushing to the fire that could damage frozen tissue. Before she left to continue her journey, Jack tried to thank her, tried to offer payment, but she refused. "You learn," she said firmly. "That is payment. You teach others. Knowledge must travel like water, flowing to those who need it." In the years that followed, Jack Morrison became known throughout the territory for his survival skills. He taught other ranchers what Na Lin had taught him, how to read weather signs, how to create emergency shelter from snow, how to respect the land's power rather than fight against it. He learned more Apache words, made peace with the tribes in his area, and traded fairly with them. And every winter, when the first serious snow fell, he would look out at the white landscape and remember the night an Apache girl had saved his life by teaching him that sometimes the thing you fear most can become the thing that saves you. The cold that kills can also protect. The snow that buries can also shelter. Survival is not about conquering nature but about understanding it, working with it, respecting the ancient knowledge of those who learned to thrive in harsh lands long before settlers arrived with their certainty that their ways were best. Jack never saw Na Lin again, though he asked after her in Apache camps and trading posts. Some said she had married and moved north. Others said she had become a teacher to her own people, passing on the old ways to younger generations. But whether he saw her again or not, her lesson remained with him every day of his life. That wisdom comes from unexpected places, that pride can be deadly, and that sometimes the greatest strength is admitting you have something to learn from those you had dismissed as having nothing to teach.